The stuff I'm about to tell you is sensitive. All of this has to stay strictly between us.
Fair enough. What you say won't go any further. I can keep a secret with the best of them.
Well, I arrived here today in a time machine from a point 20 years in the future, give or take.
Wait, are you serious? You traveled back from the future?
After the Trojan War, Odysseus, the clever strategist who had the idea of deceiving his adversaries by hiding Greek soldiers in a large wooden horse, returns home with his crew. Towards the end of their journey, they are confronted with the dangerous song of the sirens. But Odysseus has plugged the ears of his sailors with wax and has tied himself to the mast so that he can hear the sirens singing without risking throwing himself in the sea. In Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, Kirk and his crew leave Vulcan aboard the bird of prey they captured from the Klingons in the previous film and return home to stand trial for the crimes that they committed by going to find Spock on Genesis.
You'd think they could at least send a ship. It's bad enough to be court-martialed and spend the rest of our lives mining borite, but to have to go home in this Klingon fleet trap.
You can learn a thing or two from this fleet trap. It's got a cloaking device that costs us a lot.
As they approach Earth, it's not the bewitching song of the sirens that they are confronted with, but the destructive song of a gigantic and mysterious probe aimed at the oceans.
Do not approach Earth. The transmissions of an orbiting probe are causing critical damage to this planet.
Thanks to Uhura, who converts the song so that you can hear it as if you were underwater,
I think I have it, sir.
Spock recognized the song of humpback whales, a species that was hunted until extinction 300 years ago.
Only human arrogance would assume the message must be meant for man.
Obviously, the probe will not leave without having received a response to its calls, which continue to affect the Earth. To remedy the situation, Kirk decides to use a technique he and his crew learned during their 5-year mission to time travel. Using this technique, they go looking for humpback whales in the past, and yes, they do all of that in Christopher Lloyd's vehicle.
Kirk, your time runs out.
As we've seen in previous episodes of this video essay series, the first 3 Star Trek films dealt respectively with rebirth, death, and resurrection, notably of Spock, but also of the franchise itself. If Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home concludes a narrative trilogy begun with the Wrath of Khan, it begins a new thematic trilogy within what will be a hexalogy. Indeed, now that the franchise has been resurrected and that Spock has become a Christ figure, Star Trek can finally do what Star Trek knows how to do best. And Spock, through his interpreter and once again director Leonard Nimoy, can do what Christ figures do best, which is to preach the good word, or in more generic terms, deliver a message. The original series often passed its messages through allegories.
It is obvious to the most simple-minded that Loki is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Look at me. Look at me.
You're black on one side and white on the other.
I am black on the right side.
I fail to see the significant difference.
Loki is white on the right side. All of his people are white on the right side.
But in The Voyage Home, the message is not allegorical. Rather, it echoes the movement started by Greenpeace a few years earlier to save whales from commercial fishing, which was decimating them. However, according to William Shatner and Nimoy himself, The Voyage Home was not designed to convey a message.
It's not a message picture, but there are some ideas about what's happening on Earth today in the 20th century that I think we're having some fun with and which the audience will recognize and enjoy, I hope.
I think they'll have a few laughs, and I think they'll be excited by the premise and be suitably amazed by the special effects.
In this picture, I think we have done, I hope, the most fun, adventure, humorous Star Trek yet. A real runaway, have a good time, scary, exciting adventure with fun.
Is The Voyage Home really nothing more than an entertaining messageless adventure film? What is a message, and why is this term not anonymous among writers? In his excellent text How Not to Write Stories, found on the website of science fiction magazine Solaris, author Yves Ménard says the following: "If you're one of those who believe that a story must deliver a message to be valid, you have gone to the wrong address. It's an essay, an article for a think tank, a letter to the press that you want to write, not a fiction. The vast majority of people who read fiction read it for entertainment, not to be lectured." I would add for my part that writing a story to convey a message is very pretentious. When I was in Cégep, the film teachers I was confronted with insisted that my films convey a message, and it was infuriating me. I was 18. What miraculous wisdom was I able to pass on to my peers? Today, I'm almost twice that age, and I still ask myself the question. But I've come to understand that people who ask us to include messages in our stories are actually very badly communicating to us what they really want. A little further in this text, Yves Ménard adds, "You're on the wrong track because you have subjugated your text to the moral it must give. Your main character behaves like an idiot because they have to demonstrate the message in action. Your plot is rigged to make sure the good guys win because they put the message into action. Your villains are simplistic and ridiculous because they have to oppose the truth of the great message. Thus, the message would be both a moral transmitted to the public and a lesson that the protagonist must learn to defeat his adversary. It's true that this is often the case in typical Hollywood stories, but by always associating all these terms together, we ended up confusing their respective definitions and forgetting their narrative functions. In the next few minutes, my goal is not to pretend I'm some sort of a writing guru, but simply to enlighten you on tried and tested writing techniques that should be mastered before you try to break them."
Yes.
Sir, what if a writer is attempting to create a story where nothing much happens, where people don't change, they don't have any epiphanies, they struggle and are frustrated and nothing is resolved? More a reflection of the real world.
The real world?
Yes, sir.
The real fucking world. First of all, you write a screenplay without conflict or crisis, you'll bore your audience to tears. Secondly, nothing happens in the world? Are you out of your fucking mind? People are murdered every day. There's genocide, war, corruption. Every fucking day, somewhere in the world, somebody sacrifices his life to save somebody else. Every fucking day, someone somewhere takes a conscious decision to destroy someone else. People find love, people lose it. For Christ's sake, a child watches a mother beaten to death on the steps of a church. Someone goes hungry. Somebody else betrays his best friend for a woman. If you can't find that stuff in life, then you, my friend, don't know crap about life. And why the fuck are you wasting my 2 precious hours with your movie? I don't have any use for it. I don't have any bloody use for it.
Okay, thanks.
And of course, it's always possible to find exceptions to each of the rules defended by screenwriting coaches.
God help you if you use voiceover in your work, my friends. God help you.
Captain's log, stardate 8390. We're in the 3rd month of our Vulcan exile, and it was Dr. McCoy with a fine sense of historical irony who decided on a name for our captured Klingon vessel.
Every work of fiction carries within it the worldview of its creator, whether they are aware of it or not. It's a fact I've repeated many times on this channel, and it's why nothing is ever just entertainment unless you've managed to write a wildly incoherent story. However, the worldview is not necessarily a moral the work of fiction tries to teach to the public. For example, Disney's The Beauty and the Beast unintentionally cast Stockholm Syndrome as something romantic, when instead it sought to teach that people shouldn't be judged by their looks. If you've watched other videos on this channel, you know that cancel culture is nothing new, and it certainly didn't start with woke ideology. It's actually quite the opposite. But this new wave coming from the left does tend to confuse worldview and moral, and thus to content creators who are often not even aware of what their works of fiction convey as a worldview because they were too busy explaining the moral they were really trying to convey. In most cases, I'm of the opinion that we must remain vigilant in regard to the worldviews conveyed by the works of fiction we consume, and that we must above all be wary of those who encourage us to turn off our brains. But is the moral always a lesson? And are the protagonists always idiots when they don't act on that lesson? No. Here again, it's necessary to choose better words if we want to understand how a story works. Instead of lesson, we will rather use the term truth, and in place of idiot, we will rather use the term imperfect. We like our heroes when they're imperfect. That's what makes them accessible to us, and if they were never wrong, then either they would succeed in everything they set out to do immediately and without difficulty, which would generally make for a very boring story, or they would only face external obstacles. And if a protagonist faces only external obstacles, that means they don't have a positive dramatic arc, like the one Hollywood has gotten us used to, or even negative but flat. Mind you, not flat as in boring, but as the form. And in a story where the protagonist has a flat dramatic arc, guess where the conflict comes from? from his imperfect entourage to whom the protagonist must teach a truth. In other words, if the protagonist is not imperfect, if he does not lack a truth, then his entourage is imperfect and it is his entourage that lacks a truth. And if the protagonist and his entourage are perfect and know the truth, then there is no conflict, and without conflict, there is generally no story. Which brings me back to a quote from Yves Ménard: "The vast majority of people who read fiction read it for entertainment, not to be lectured. Yet, as we have just seen, a typical story inevitably contains a lecture, even if that may not be the reason for which it is consumed. One could just as easily say, the vast majority of people who eat a meal eat to satisfy their appetite, not to give their bodies the nutrients they need to fabricate their cells and maintain their body's chemical balances. Whether you are aware of it or not, your body will look for what it needs in food even if you only eat out of greed. Just as your brain will look for what it needs in a story, even if you consume it only to be entertained. That's why we create stories, and that's still why we tell them today." Although I had written a similar paragraph during the preparation of this series of video essays, here is what John Truby says in his recent book, The Anatomy of Genres. "Storytelling influences every aspect of a person's life. Parenting is full of storytelling. We tell stories to our kids at bedtime, we tell stories to our teenagers to prevent them from doing drugs, and we need to be better storytellers than the others who try to influence them. At work, we need to tell a compelling story to drum up business, and politics uses story to exercise power. The same goes for advertisements. Do you really believe that an advertisement is intended to entertain you? No. An advertisement aims to convince you that you are imperfect and that you need a truth. In this case, the product or service advertised. Sure, the creator of the ad went to great lengths to make their ad entertaining, but if you believe it's just entertainment, you're letting that creator play a trick on you, and it's the same with any work of fiction. So it's very possible that Nimoy didn't purposely use the Voyage Home to convey a message, and that his sole purpose was to entertain us. But by writing a cohesive story featuring heroes and obstacles, Nimoy and the other screenwriters of the film have all the same designed a work of fiction carrying at the same time a moral, a worldview, and a truth. It would seem that even when entertainment is supposedly our only objective, it does not contradict the possibility of a lecture. The moral of the Voyage Home, as we have seen, is very clear. We need to treat our planet and its various life forms better. That being said, if Kirk and his crew go back in time to save whales, it's only to prevent Earth from being annihilated by an alien probe in the future. Moreover, by showing that we can just go back in time to repair a mistake of the past, the film implies that there will always be someone in the future to clean our mess. William Shatner himself didn't want time travel in Star Trek IV because he felt it was a deus ex machina, whereby it becomes possible for the characters to solve all their problems, especially when the writers don't follow rules.
Don't you dare bring in a deus ex machina.
And it's hard to follow rules in time travel stories because often the writers want to have it both ways. They both want Marty's trip to the past to impact the future, like in the movie The Butterfly Effect, where every action in the past alters the course of history, while also showing that it's thanks to his journey into the past that the future is as it is.
Chuck! Chuck! It's Marvin! Your cousin, Marvin Barry! You know that new sound you're looking for? Well, listen to this!
As is the case, for example, in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. To resolve these contradictions, fans will not hesitate to propose other rules, such as those found in stories where time forms a loop, within which even if reality is previously marked by a future journey into the past of a character, it's possible for the journey to unfold differently within this loop, and thus the character modifies a future yet already affected beforehand. Complicated, isn't it? And that was me being nice and not mentioning Primer.
Why is it odd? How did you know it was odd? Okay, because this is it, okay? This is what's going on. There's an AN and there's a BN. Okay, let's say the AN is 12 o'clock, the BN is 12:01. All right, we start the machine with the Weeble at the AN. It travels forward normal.
You gotta write this down.
Aaron, there's nothing to write down.
While writing The Voyage Home, the writers immediately agreed that they weren't going to rack their brains about the rules of time travel, even going so far as to laugh at the rules.
You realize, of course, if we give him the formula, we're altering the future.
What? How do we know he didn't invent the thing?
Maybe Scotty is right, and he's revealing the formula for transparent aluminium to whoever was going to figure it out anyway. The same way Spock was going to reveal the formula for transwarp teleportation to him several years later, or several years earlier, depending on your point of view. Chekhov, on the other hand, abandons his phaser on a naval base, and it obviously has no impact on the future, which was later resolved in the novelization and the Star Trek Expanded Universe. But we end up completely missing out on the joke. In dramaturgy, the Chekhov's gun is a plot device that has become over time an expression to describe the information planted by the story with the aim of being collected later. And so, in The Voyage Home, Since the phaser abandoned by Chekhov in the 80s does not alter the future in any way, Chekhov's gun fails to be a Chekhov's gun.
Oh! Yes. Yes.
The time travel portion of the film was actually written by the Wrath of Khan's director, Nicholas Meyer, who made his very first film, a time travel story also set in San Francisco.
Why'd you watch where you're going, you dumbass? Well, a double dumbass on you!
It's a miracle these people ever got out of the 20th century.
They're still using money. We gotta find something.
Amazing. I haven't seen stones in settings like these since before the war.
18th century American. Quite valuable. Are you sure you want to part with them?
How much are they worth?
Excuse me. Weren't those a birthday present from Dr. McCoy?
And they will be again. That's the beauty of it. How much?
Well, they'd be worth more if the lenses were intact. I'll give you $100.
Is that a lot?
And note that Meyer's participation to the Voyage Home leads to new literary references.
Nobody pays any attention to you unless you swear every other word. You'll find it in all the literature of the period.
For example?
Well, the collected works of Jacqueline Suzanne. The novels are Harold Robbins.
Ah. The Giants.
They say the sea is cold, but the sea contains the hottest blood of all.
Whales weep not. D.H. Lawrence.
Also, is it ironic to see Kirk and his crew attempt to save whales at the end of a trilogy that began with a confrontation with Khan, an avid fan of the whaler Captain Ahab?
To the last, we grapple with thee.
Going back to the film's flawed message and its deus ex machina, these are part of a tendency for Star Trek to ignore the ecological impact of the technology it features. As Jorge Gonzalez says in his book The Politics of Star Trek lacks an environmental ethic, ignores the global warming crisis, and evades profound environmental problems through what can be deemed as fantasy solutions, most especially using the plot device of dilithium crystal. After watching Star Trek Discovery, I'd say that's changing, but at the time of the Voyage Home, it's indeed the first time that ecology occupies such a prominent place in the plot, and also the first time that it reigns in Star Trek, by the way. Thankfully, the film can be forgiven for its flawed message for 3 reasons. The first is its humorous tone.
I think you did a little too much LDS.
LDS?
After the 2 rather dark films that are The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock, Nimoy wanted lightness.
He'll sing anywhere from 6 to as long as 30 minutes and then start again. In the ocean, the other whales will pick up the song and pass it on. The songs change every year, and we still don't know what purpose they serve. Are they some kind of navigational signal? Could they be part of the mating ritual? Or is it pure communication beyond our comprehension? Frankly, we just don't know yet.
Maybe he's singing to that man.
With The Voyage Home, Nimoy pushes Star Trek to the limits of self-parody, not unlike the Trouble with Tribbles episode of the original series. In fact, Star Trek isn't even the only series to momentarily parody itself. X-Files has done it very often, as have, for example, Stargate and Supernatural. This allows the creators of this series to show that they are capable of laughing at themselves and that they are aware of the suspension of disbelief that they are asking viewers to consent to. In The Voyage Home, Nimoy proves what he was going for in The Search for Spock, that even after removing space travel and starship battles, Star Trek is still Star Trek because of its characters. And I would argue that if we still love the characters of the original series so much today, it's mainly thanks to the 2 films of Nimoy, which give us so many memorable scenes.
Excuse me. Would you mind stopping that noise? The sins of all our fathers be dumped on us the sons. The only choice we're given is how many megatons. Excuse me. Would you mind stopping that damn noise? And I say screw you. And I hope you're blue too. We're all bloody worthless.
Not only do the actors demonstrate that they've mastered their characters so well that they can be thrown into inhabitual comical situations without their credibility or that of the Star Trek universe collapsing, but the script also explores something else than the eternal Kirk, Spock, McCoy trio. Instead, McCoy teams up with Scotty to help the manager of a plexiglass factory to discover the formula of transparent aluminum, a material they'll need to transport the wells on the ship.
I've tried to clear things up, Professor Scott. I explained that you'd come all the way here from Edinburgh on appointment to study methods of manufacturing by Plexicore, but they don't seem to know anything about it. Don't know anything about it? I find it hard to believe that I've come millions of miles. Thousands of miles.
For their part, Chekhov and Uhura team up to extract the photons from a nuclear reactor, which they need to return to their time.
Can you help us?
Please, we're looking for the naval base in Alameda. Could you tell me where the nuclear vessels are?
Ooh, I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think it's across the bay. In Alameda.
That's what I said, Alameda. I know that.
But where is Alameda?
Thus, the script allows the characters to exist outside their habitual narrative shackles, except for Sulu, who only swaps the controls of a spaceship for those of a helicopter. Nevertheless, it's the prominent 7th members of our beloved crew who explore the planet rather than the already mentioned trio accompanied by a handful of red shirts. The second reason why the film is forgiven for its flawed ecological message is that it contains another moral arguably more visible these days. Indeed, as Lauren Tallman points out in her article "The biggest lesson from Star Trek: The Voyage Home isn't talked about enough," let's get back to the idea that this convoluted plot to steal wells from 300 years in the past is somehow a simpler solution than trying to communicate with a space probe. Unlike, say, Armageddon, the plot of Star Trek IV really isn't trying to pull a fast one on us by trying to convince us that an incredibly complex task is easier than the simpler option. Instead, it's suggesting that communication is the complex task, and that to oversimplify it only contributes to, quite literally, our own destruction. We see it today all over the news cycles. As the wealthy make decisions for the working class, men speak with presumed authority on issues affecting women, and white people attempt to explain away the racism experienced by people of color. Many times, no harm is intended, but that doesn't prevent it from occurring anyway. Star Trek IV is a film about an advanced group of people using every last ounce of their privilege to ensure that the mic gets passed to those whose lived experience and knowledge uniquely qualifies them to speak to a specific situation. In other words, The Voyage Home teaches us how to become better allies. Finally, the third reason the film is forgiven for its flawed ecological message that we just have to go back in time to fix our mistakes is that the real time travel happens through the screen. By claiming to offer us a look into the future, the film warns us so that we, the audience, not the heroes, can save the whales and treat our planet better while there's still time. Which brings me to the worldview conveyed in The Voyage Home. The Voyage Home doesn't blame a typical big bad guy for the disappearance of the whales. Granted, whalers aren't helping whales to stay alive, but their actions are part of a system that encourages people to enrich themselves financially in ignorance or even recklessness of their long-term effects on the ecosystem. As soon as they arrive in the 80s, Kirk and his crew discover a society that produces a lot of waste. It seems that it's usually the first thing you discover when you arrive in the 80s: waste and homelessness. Are these problems the work of a malicious person? The Voyage Home is keen to say that they are rather the work of ignorant and potentially careless people, like the manager of the plexiglass factory who does not know any greener way to earn a living before Scotty crosses his path, or like the doctors who don't know a better way to cure Chekhov's coma than to drill a hole in his head.
Sounds like the goddamn Spanish Inquisition to me.
Humans do what they have to do without worrying about their impact on the planet and its other inhabitants in the same way the alien probe does what it has to do without worrying about its impact on the planet and its other inhabitants. So the moral of the film is that you have to take care of the environment and give a voice to those who don't have one, and the worldview conveyed in the film is that most people are not fundamentally evil, but only ignorant and careless. However, our protagonists know all this. It's not a truth they need to learn in order to grow and be a little less imperfect. As usual, Kirk and Spock each have their own dramatic arc. At the start of the narrative trilogy begun with the Wrath of Khan, Kirk was a trickster who continually bluffed to get what he wanted. After having paid the price for it, in the search for Spock he bluffed much less well.
You have 2 minutes to surrender your crew and your vessel, or we will destroy you.
He's hiding something. May have dealt him a more serious blow than I thought.
And finally, in The Voyage Home, a film which demonstrates that communication is precious and fragile, Kirk learns that he's quicker at finding allies when he speaks the truth.
I am from what on your calendar would be the late 23rd century. I've come back in time to bring 2 humpback whales with me in an attempt to repopulate the species.
For his part, Spock justified his sacrifice in the Wrath of Khan with an utilitarian principle.
The needs of the many outweigh
The needs of the few.
or the one.
A principle that his friends turned on itself by sacrificing themselves for him in the following film, which Spock finds difficult to understand.
Spock, does the good of the many outweigh the good of the one?
I would accept that as an axiom.
Well, then you stand here alive because of a mistake made by your flawed, feeling human friends. They have sacrificed their futures because they believed that the good of the one, you, was more important to them.
Humans make illogical decisions.
They do indeed.
But what he learns in Voyage Home, a film that shows how caring about the well-being of others is a good thing, is that friendship is more important than logic.
May I suggest that Dr. McCoy is correct? We must help Chekhov.
Is that the logical thing to do, Spock?
No, but it is the human thing to do.
Admittedly, this isn't the first time Kirk and his crew have traveled back in time and looked ridiculous.
He was saying you'll have no trouble explaining it.
My friend is obviously Chinese. I see you've noticed the ears. They're actually easy to explain.
Perhaps the unfortunate accident I had as a child.
The unfortunate accident he had as a child. He caught his head in a mechanical rice picker.
But the Voyage Home shows that it's their misunderstanding of 1980s American society that makes them look ridiculous.
Perhaps the professor could use your computer. Please.
Computer? Computer? Hello, computer.
Just use the keyboard.
Making the film an excellent fish-out-of-the-water comedy like Beverly Hills Cop, starring Eddie Murphy, for whom the part of Jillian had previously been written.
Yeah, they had me like talking jive to Spock in San Francisco.
And it's this humorous tone that allows the film to denounce how little we know about our ecosystem and how ridiculous some of our actions are. At the end of the film, Kirk and his crew managed to save the whales George and Gracie, named after a famous comedy duo that consisted of a straight man and his goofy companion, a dynamic that is reminiscent of Kirk and Jillian, or even Kirk and Spock, who never looked so much like an old couple.
You guys like Italian?
No.
Yes.
Yeah,
No.
no.
Yes.
No.
Yes. I love Italian. And so do you.
Yes.
After which, the heroes can finally return home, where most of the charges that were held against them are dropped. The only consequence is reserved for Kirk, who is stripped of his rank of admiral and who becomes captain again. A punishment that looks more like a blessing, but not captain of just any ship, captain of the Enterprise A.
My friends, we've come home.
The words he speaks when he sees his ship mean that, contrary to what the French translation of the film's title says, the Voyage Home is not about the return to Earth. The Voyage Home is Star Trek that stops comparing itself to Star Wars.
Genesis allowed is not. Is planet forbidden. Look, my backwards friend.
It's Star Trek that can finally entertain while delivering a message.
First, what would you like people to feel or think when they come out of Star Trek 4?
Well, the number one thing, I suppose, is that they have enjoyed themselves and that they have seen a group of people who care for each other and that perhaps some kind of a message has been delivered to them along the way. We seem to have managed that during the series, and hopefully if we can leave them with that spirit, I think it would make us all happy.
As always, I hope you have appreciated this episode, and thank you for encouraging the channel by clicking on the thumbs up and on the bell. And let's meet again in a month to talk about the infamous Star Trek V.